Hey everyone, this is chapter 7 of Daniel Randall's Confronting Anti-Semitism on the Left, Arguments for Socialists. The chapter is titled Left Anti-Semitism, Racism, and Depression. There is an ostensible clarity to defining anti-Semitism as anti-Jewish racism, or even to dispensing with the term anti-Semitism altogether and putting anti-Jewish racism in its place. This labeling has much to recommend it. It situates anti-Semitism within a wider nexus of bigotry and prejudice against people on the basis of assumed racial characteristics, and embodies an implicit potential for solidarity between Jews and other victims of racism. The latest wave of the Black Lives Matter movement has carved out additional space for discussion of how contemporary racism operates and how racial inequality is structurally reproduced. Building anti-racist solidarity between Jews and other historically racialized and oppressed groups is a necessary task. The construction of such solidarity will require some political courage and self-reflection, including the acknowledgement of anti-Black and anti-Muslim racism in some Jewish communities and movements, and of anti-Semitism in some Black and some Muslim communities and movements, while also stamping out the idea that expressions of anti-Semitism by Black and Muslim people are qualitatively worse than other expressions or forms of anti-Semitism. It also requires an acknowledgement of the relative degree of privilege that is accrued to many Jewish people owing to their substantial integration into whiteness, a racial category of relatively recent construction, while recognizing that integration is both recent and precarious. Finally, it will require an amplification of the voices of Jews of color, who often face multifaceted forms of marginalization within and between the multiple communities to which they may belong. As Con Harris puts it, without integrating the fight against anti-Semitism into a wider struggle for equality and liberation, quote, Jews allow ourselves to be used as a stick to beat other minorities, fighting the anti-Semitism of marginalized Western Muslims as though it were the same as the anti-Semitism of the white majority. We can be blind to the connotation of singling out minority women of color as anti-Semitic folk devils, and at the other end of the Jewish political spectrum, we can collude in the message that other minorities can behave as they wish towards Jews, that their anti-Semitism will not count. End quote. Con Harris. A similar argument has been advanced by the Black Jewish writer Nadine Batchelor Hunt, who has suggested, quote, Black people and Jewish people need to stand together more than ever in the face of rising far-right populism, and the only way to do that is to actively dispel and debunk myths and tropes that may exist in each community. Only then can we move forward to a point of true and constructive solidarity, end quote. Nadine Batchelor Hunt. Understanding of and opposition to anti-Semitism therefore has to be built into a wider anti-racist politics, both because of the historic position of Jews as a racialized other, and because of the position of anti-Semitism as the, quote, theoretical core, end quote, of contemporary white nationalism, especially in the USA. As Eric Ward put it, in the white supremacist mindset, quote, some secret cabal, some mythological power, must be manipulating the social order behind the scenes, What is this arch nemesis of the white race, whose machinations have prevented the natural and inevitable imposition of white supremacy? It is, of course, the Jews, end quote. Ward writes that the anti-Semitism at the core of white nationalism is, quote, a particular and potent form of racism so central to white supremacy that Black people would not win our freedom without tearing it down, end quote. New section. Is left anti-Semitism racism? Thinking about anti-Semitism in total abstraction from racism would therefore be a serious error. Certainly, we cannot say, quote, anti-Semitism is not racism, end quote. Probably we can say, quote, anti-Semitism is often, even usually, a form of racism, end quote. But can we say without qualification that anti-Semitism is always racism? Is left anti-Semitism, in particular racism, And are those who express left anti-Semitic ideas therefore racist? This chapter will argue that understanding left anti-Semitism as racism is counterproductive, and that anti-Semitism more generally cannot always be nested neatly under the general header of racism. This assessment does not represent a moral value judgment. Believing left anti-Semitism is not best understood as a form of racism does not mean that left anti-Semitism is somehow more acceptable than other bigotries that can be understood as such. A form of bigotry can be dangerous without being racist. Conversely, believing that anti-Semitism has specificities which distinguish it within, and in some cases from, the generic category of racism does not mean it is worse than racism in general. But if we set out to understand the particular functioning of different bigotries, and especially in understanding how anti-Semitism manifests, specifically on the left, collapsing it into a general category of racism sets us back. Many expressions of anti-Semitism are clearly, classically racist. Such expressions of anti-Semitism assert the existence of a Jewish race, one of a number of racialized collectivities, which is presumed to have particular characteristics, somehow derived from biology and passed on via heredity. But, unlike in many other forms of racism, where the imagined racial characteristics are used to inform simplistic binaries, anti-Semitism contends that Jews use these characteristics to achieve dominance. As Pastone wrote, Moshe Pastone, quote, "The way in which anti-Semitism is distinguished, and should be distinguished from racism, has to do with the sort of imaginary power attributed to the Jews, Zionism, and Israel. The sort of imaginary of power attributed to Jews, Zionism, and Israel, which is at the heart of anti-Semitism. The Jews are seen as constituting an immensely powerful, abstract, intangible global form of power that dominates the world. There is nothing similar to this idea at the heart of other forms of racism." End quote. Moshe Pastone. Anti-Semitism is also distinguished by its age. As Martin Thomas puts it, quote, "Anti-Semitism is much older than racism. It is possible, of course, to stretch the term racism by back-defining it to cover many phenomena from centuries before the term existed. But to do that blurs rather than clarifies. In particular, it blurs the ways in which anti-Semitism operates quite differently from general racism, or, if you insist on putting it that way, from other racism." End quote. Martin Thomas. Stretching the definition of racism, a category that presupposes the social construction of the concept of, quote, race, to cover any instance of bigotry, prejudice, or chauvinism on the basis of religion, religious, ethnic, national, or communal difference throughout history, also serves to blur what is historically distinct about modern racism. Modern racism has particular roots in the white supremacist ideological scaffolding, placed as justification around the economically driven enslavement of black Africans and the colonial expansion of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. These are not its sole roots, but they are key ones. The origins of modern racism therefore overlap and intertwine with the origins of capitalism, giving developing capitalism, at the global level, a racialized character that, notwithstanding the widespread achievement of formal legal equality and other gains of anti-racist struggle, it substantially retains. Anti-Semitism has parallels with that, with modern anti-Semitism forming partly in the development of capitalist modernity, including via the enforced role of Jews in mercantile trades and the exclusion of Jews into ghettos or proscribed territories. This often forcibly placed Jews in a position that was simultaneously at the center and on the margins of developing capitalism. The historic racialization, in which a group is socially ascribed the status of a, quote, race, end quote, of Jewish immigrants to Britain was also closely linked to an economically rooted imperialist prejudice, which also found expression in the labor movement and on the left via agitation for controls on immigration. The protectionist nationalist arguments of socialist anti-Semites in the late 19th and early 20th centuries persist in the contemporary labor movement through arguments designating migrant workers as a threat to the economic conditions or even the way of life of the local working class. As Steve Cohen showed in That's Funny, nationalist anti-migrant racism, especially in the labor movement and would-be left, took shape substantially in an anti-Semitic agitation. An overemphasis on the distinctions between anti-Semitism and racism can, therefore, obscure their shared features. Nonetheless, narrowing the definition of racism to refer only to phenomena directly traceable to the European colonial subjugation of peoples of color can also be analytically limiting, failing to meaningfully process, quote, the anomalous position Jews sometimes occupy within an anti-racist imaginary focused on whiteness and empire, end quote. As Camilla Bassi writes, quote, the colonial model of racism, as prevalent in U.S. and British academia, and indeed on the wider political left, is not able to explain the combination of events, circumstances, and social relations in which certain populations have been racialized and excluded without being colonized. End quote. And Camilla Bassi. An insistence on the, quote, colonial model, end quote, as racism's only form is particularly damaging in the context of left anti-Semitism, as it erases the specificities and complexities of the history of Jewish immigration to Palestine, the formation of a Hebrew-speaking Jewish national community in Palestine, and the foundation of the State of Israel. The colonial model substitutes in their place a simplistic binary, white colonizers oppressing non-white colonial subjects. That somehow renders Jews fleeing genocide or post-Holocaust refugees in displaced person camps, the agents of a straightforwardly white supremacist colonial project with no internal contradictions of its own nor any relationship to Jews' own experiences of racism. At the time, the contemporary far left rejected that view. As discussed in Chapter 5, in 1948, the Palestinian Trotskyists denounced as a, quote, racial war, end quote, not Jewish immigration to Palestine, but the Arab League's assault. As also noted in Chapter 5, black radicals such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Eldridge Cleaver saw parallels between Zionism and their own struggles, a perspective which thoroughly complicates claims that Zionism is an extension of empire-building, European white supremacist colonialism. Brian Klug wrote that Zionism, quote, spoke the language of colonization, but for the sake of emancipation, not empire, end quote. Some Zionists undoubtedly did and do see Arabs as a racialized inferior other. There can be racism between racialized subjects and even within racialized groups. And although the oppression of the Palestinians by the Israeli state is in essence a national rather than racial oppression, the barriers between categories of, quote, nationality, quote, ethnicity, and, quote, race are often permeable. As Frantz Fanon noted, it is possible to pass from nationalism, quote, to ultranationalism, to chauvinism, and finally racism, end quote, which, as Martin Thomas puts it, quote, can take markers other than skin color to tag the group to be denied equal rights, end quote. Conversely, as noted in Chapter 5, some left anti-Semites have recognized, quote, Arab racism against Israel, end quote, in order to celebrate it as progressive. We must acknowledge, then, the possibility of types of racism that do not fit neatly into the, quote, colonial model, end quote, with racialized others who are not necessarily historic colonial subjects. But wholly defining all variants of anti-Semitism as racism blurs the specificity of anti-Semitism as a pre-racial bigotry which often has distinct ideological characteristics, even when expressed in racial terms. At the same time, this extends the definition of racism backwards into history, to include all forms of ethnic or communal chauvinism, and risks blurring what is distinct about modern racism. Understanding anti-Semitism is only and always a form of racism can blunt our analysis of forms of anti-Semitism, historic and contemporary, that are not linked to racialized categories. The prejudice, hostility, and potential bigotry that left anti-Semitism implies towards the vast majority of Jews is on the basis of assumed political rather than racial biological characteristics. Those on the left who balk at the suggestion they might be carriers of some implicitly anti-Semitic ideas often reflexively defend themselves by insisting they are opposed to racism, insisting in response that left anti-Semitism is racism, necessitates a psychological interrogation as to whether their professed position to racist anti-Semitism, to the idea that Jews should be discriminated against on the basis of hereditary and assumed racial characteristics, is really sincere. That would be fruitless. As Martin Thomas has written, quote, much better to say to those with political anti-Semitic views, yes, of course, I know you abhor racist anti-Semitism as much as anyone. I know you think your views are only ... opposition to a sort of politics, Zionism, and a state with that sort of politics. But here is something special about your political opposition to what you call, quote, Zionism, a quality different from that of your political opposition to neoliberalism, ... or whatever, and that, quote, something special, end quote, has implications which may make you want to reconsider, end quote. Martin Thomas. Camilla Bassi argues that left anti-Semitism is a form of racism as it involves a process of signification that defines the other by real and imagined cultural features, and marks out a group of people in relation to Israeli/Zionist Jewishness, and assigns this categorized group of bodies with negative characteristics and is giving rise to negative consequences. This Jewish other is generalized with a singular and static understanding of Israel and Zionism, that this Jewish collective has uniquely world-domineering and tyrannical power, end quote. Camilla Bassi. Just as a side note, if you think about how racism, oftentimes contemporary racism, is not biologized, right? It's not. It's oftentimes like there's usually in like modern racism, there's usually not a or often not. I mean, obviously in the case of like Nazis or white supremacists who acknowledge themselves as such, it's usually biologized, right? But generally speaking, it takes on more of a cultural form, right? So if you think of like racism against black people, oftentimes that racism is not couched in kind of any kind of like inherent qualities of black people, but is usually like a commentary about some like uh, deep core features about what is said to be like their black culture or something like that, right? Um, you can also think of it in terms of like how like you know forced assimilation of native peoples in the United States, and say like the boarding schools. I don't know the precise term, but the idea of like killing the Indian but saving the man. The idea that it's usually some kind of like usually has a cultural streak. Um, Usually, I think that for me personally, I think that uh, anti-Semitism uh, is kind of in contemporary consciousness is very much guided by the experience of the Third Reich, which was extremely biologist in its outlook and racist in its outlook, um, which is and that kind of like specific instantiation of anti-Semitic thinking is kind of falsely generalized to the whole of what could be considered anti-Semitic thinking, uh, you know, in the 20th and 21st century. So I think that you can be racist or say racist thing or harbor racist beliefs without any kind of like, without biologizing race in a certain sense. You can view it as kind of like you can view it as like a, you know, like you can view it in a way that's like, it's not inherent in some kind of physical sense, but in like the cultural sense, right? Like there's an inherent, you know, if you think of like the culture of poverty, right? It's not inherent. Like someone who might think in those terms would be like, it's not inherent that black people are lazy, but it's just so that their social culture um, encourages laziness and habits that are self-destructive, um, and ultimately destructive of the larger social body as well. But it's not necessarily like that they're like, have to be that way. They choose to be that way. Their culture encourages them to be that way. Um, if that makes sense. And I feel like we could all say that that was like a racist argument. Um, it's not about, without kind of like, saying, oh yeah, black people as such are this way, you know. Back to the text. Bossi is right to identify that left anti-Semitism involves a form of, quote, othering, end quote, of Jews, avoidable only by performative disavowal of any affinity with Israel. However, this perversely, and as Sean Montgomery noted in his 1988 open letter to Tony Cliff, the founder of the Socialist Workers' Party, has, in formal terms, more in common with pre-racial Christian anti-Semitism than with racist anti-Semitism. Christian anti-Semitism offered its victims an escape from itself by conversion to Christianity. Similarly, Jews can escape the implied hostility of left anti-Semitism by, quote, converting, end quote, to an absolute anti-Zionism, boycotting Israel, eschewing any sympathy or support for historic Jewish immigration to Palestine, or the rights of contemporary Israeli Jewish national group, denying the possibility of anti-Semitism on the left, and accepting a geopolitical narrative that, quote, identifies Israel as the world's hyper-imperialism, end quote. If Jews can pass these, quote, loyalty tests, end quote, as Steve Cohen called them, they are welcomed into the community of the good, and frequently aggressively tokenized as evidence that anti-Semitism cannot exist on the left, because look, here is a Jew who also demonizes Zionism and Israel. States often attempt to discipline racialized minorities into the belief that if they act in a certain state-sanctioned way, they will be able to escape racism. But the material constitution of racism in relations of power means it cannot be, ultimately and definitively, escaped, regardless of how many loyalty tests the racialized minority passes. The relations of power must be overthrown. But Jews on the left really can escape the political hostility of left anti-Semitism by passing the loyalty test set for them. Indeed, some prominent standard bearers of left anti-Semitism are themselves ethnically and/or religiously Jewish, insisting that such people are presumably, quote, self-hating, end quote. Anti-Jewish racists add nothing to our understanding of left anti-Semitism, and makes it harder, not easier, to confront it. Some critics of left anti-Semitism have preferred to designate anti-Semitism as an oppression. In an explanatory note in the introduction to her excellent 2007 pamphlet, The Past Didn't Go Anywhere, April Rosenblum defines anti-Semitism succinctly as, quote, oppression against Jews, end quote. I believe that for the concept of oppression to have meaning, it must refer to something structural and systemic, a relation of power, not only speech or ideas. It simply implies institutional discrimination, structural inequality in areas such as jobs and housing, and invariably violence against a group of people with a shared characteristic such as gender, sexuality, disability, ethnicity, nationality, or religion. Oppression is often directly state-sponsored, or, in instances where a state may be formally committed to equality, state-tolerated or perpetuated by failures to enact that commitment to equality. Much historic anti-Semitism has clearly been spectacularly oppressive in this structural sense. The discrimination that Jews experienced under Stalinism was also undeniably oppressive, and as such, left anti-Semitism could be said to have roots in the ideological buttressing of anti-Semitic oppression. But flatly describing all forms of contemporary anti-Semitism as, quote, oppression against Jews, end quote, is misleading. To argue that I, as a white Jew in modern Britain, am, quote, oppressed, end quote, by anti-Semitism is to dematerialize what oppression is. I am highly unlikely to be denied a job or a tenancy or a place at an educational institution because I am Jewish. I am not paid less on average than my non-Jewish workmates. I am not more likely to be harassed or brutalized by the police because I am Jewish or deported because of my Jewishness. Some Jews do face what might be termed structural or systemic social barriers. Charedi communities in Britain have higher rates of poverty than the average, and some Charedi Jews face access barriers related to language. I don't know if I'm saying that right. It might be Haredi now that I'm thinking about it. It is, however, highly debatable whether these are instances of a specifically anti-Semitic systemic oppression, rather than the consequences of systemic state discrimination against non-English speaking migrant heritage people in general. New section. Ideological bigotry. There are dangers here. Some on the left use the fact that Jews are not targeted by state racism or subject to systemic oppression to dismiss the possibility of racist anti-Semitism entirely, arguing, for instance, that, quote, Jews are a prosperous, privileged section of the white community. There's no racism that I can discern, ... Racism is experienced by black and Asian people, bracket, in Britain, end bracket, not Jewish people, end quote. And obviously, anyone who knows anything about history is that when the Nazis came to power, there was a great deal of assimilation of the small Jewish minority in Germany. The fact that not that it was bereft of discrimination, but it didn't have the character of, say, black people in like the Jim Crow South or something like that. Or now. The fact that Jews are not systemically oppressed by the state does not mean they cannot, quote, experience racism, end quote, including racist violence. This attitude ignores racist anti-Semitic attacks by non-state actors, such as the white supremacist far right or Islamists, and is also highly complacent about the possibility of regressive developments. The dematerialization of anti-Semitism from a materially constituted repression to a primarily ideological bigotry is not fixed. It could change, perhaps sharply and rapidly. As April Rosenblum rightly notes, quote, in some of the most famous examples of anti-Jewish expulsion and mass murder, i.e. medieval Spain or modern Germany, just prior to the attacks, Jews appeared to be one of the society's most successful, comfortable, well-integrated minorities, end quote. April Rosenblum. As stated, most Jews' integration into whiteness is both recent and precarious. Just how precarious is evidenced by Donald Trump's explicit use of anti-Semitic dog whistle phrases and imagery in his campaign adverts, and the use of similar dog whistles such as, quote, globalist, a term used by many on the far right to refer to the so-called, quote, financial elites. Further evidence is provided by reference to, quote, cultural Marxism. a far-right conspiracy theory that posits an effort by Frankfurt School Marxists, prominently including several Jewish figures, to subvert Western culture through infiltration of academic institutions, by Viktor Orban's government in Hungary, or senior Tory politicians such as Jacob Rees-Mogg and Suella Braverman. These people are not members of marginal neo-Nazi sects. They are presidents and ministers, leading political representatives of a section of their respective national ruling classes. Nor has anti-Semitic violence disappeared. It especially threatened Jews where Jewishness is outwardly visible, for example, through religious clothing, and Jewish religion and communal institutions such as synagogues. The Community Security Trust, which collects data on anti-Semitic incidents, recorded 3 incidents of, quote, extreme violence, end quote, in 2020, compared with 1 in 2019, and 97 incidents categorized as, quote, assault, end quote. Incidents spiked against the backdrop of intensifying violence in Israel-Palestine in May 2021, and included a convoy of cars that drove through areas of North London with significant Jewish population shouting slogans such as, quote, fuck Jews, rape their mothers, rape their daughters, end quote. And as incidents such as the 2018 shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh showed, murderous white supremacist far-right violence against Jews remains a particular threat. It is plausible that, given certain conditions, the exploitation of anti-Semitic ideas by ruling parties in Britain and America, or figures within them, could license more widespread anti-Jewish violence and discrimination that, over time and via links with elements of state power, might harden into structural oppression. Those dangers are real and the left must be alive to them. Rosenblum refers to anti-Semitism as, quote, the amazing disappearing oppression, end quote, parodying the idea that, quote, anti-Semitism is over, end quote, because Jews are no longer structurally discriminated against in the ways traditionally associated with oppression. She is absolutely right to argue that anti-Semitism is not, quote, over because of Jewish integration into whiteness, or the relative social prosperity of Jews in a country like Britain. But understanding oppression is constituted in relations of power and structural inequalities, and therefore not seeing Jews in Britain or America as a currently oppressed group, in that material sense, does not require us to contend that anti-Semitism is, quote, over, only to understand that it has changed. In a sense, it is anti-Semitism that has dematerialized, and is expressed now at the level of attitudes and ideas rather than structural relations of power. Those attitudes and ideas can impel physical violence, but that is not the same as a system of oppression. Denying that, and insisting that anti-Semitism currently and always constitutes oppression, risks making us less sensitive to regressive developments, and sensing the moment when anti-Semitism might, to adapt a phrase from Marx and Engels, quote, descend from language into life, end quote, and once again become a systemic oppression. Indeed, acknowledging that the functioning of anti-Semitism has changed should, but rooting us in an understanding that the dynamics involved are not fixed, make us more aware of the reality that it could change back. Failure to distinguish between the different ways racism and anti-Semitism are expressed and constructed in society, as well as their overlapping and shared features, can also lead to Jews of color being especially marginalized and having their, quote, identities pitted against each other, particularly if they are assertive in confronting both anti-Semitism within black communities and anti-black racism within Jewish communities. Sorry, one second. Sorry. When some right-wing political forces, such as Trumpism, attempt to tokenize a politically constructed version of Jewish identity based on uncritical support for Israel and hostility to Muslims, leftist critique of that will be sharper if we are able to identify the distinctions between categories of racism, anti-Semitism, and oppression, as well as the points at which they might touch or overlap. Left anti-Semitism in particular has even less connection to anything that might be understood as structural oppression than contemporary anti-Semitism in general. Reading social media posts or hearing comments in meetings from fellow leftists about the assumed power of Israel and Zionism might make me angry, upset, wearied. I may feel oppressed in the sense of being put upon and overwhelmed, but does this amount to oppression in a concrete structural sense? I would suggest not. I acknowledge that I speak from a position of privilege and relative comfort in that as a white, cisgendered, heterosexual male, I have no direct experience of structural oppression. I am also someone with, at the time of writing, nearly 20 years of close encounters with various ideological maladies of the far left behind me, and a hopefully unshakable conviction that they can and must be confronted and changed. Perhaps all of that inures me to the oppressive potential of left anti-Semitism. I also acknowledge that accumulated hurt of the type many Jews experience when continually confronted with anti-Semitism in left-wing spaces, both online and physical, can have a profound effect on people's mental well-being and may well affect the extent to which they feel able to participate in left-wing movements. That is a serious matter, which requires dealing with on its own terms. But hurt and distress are not enough to constitute oppression. Indeed, describing left anti-Semitism as an oppression could have the effect of blurring our analysis of the very real and immediate structural oppressions on the basis of color, gender, sexuality, disability, or immigration status that are deeply imbricated with capitalist class exploitation in a way left anti-Semitism simply is not. The left should reject the notion that oppression and relations of power can be created, rather than reflected, by the mere expression of ideas. Someone expressing bigoted ideas about someone else does not, in and of itself, create a relationship of structural power between them. Ultimately insisting on left anti-Semitism as a form of anti-Jewish oppression will lead us down a blind alley, searching for ways to overthrow the power relation we imagine it reflects, rather than confronting it at the level of ideas and seeking to persuade its adherents of different ones. It bears repeating that analyzing a bigotry is not immediately connected to or expressed by a material relation of power and equality does not make it less bad in a moral sense. In writing this chapter, I acknowledge the risk that some cynical denialist might, quote, weaponize, end quote, it, approximately thus, quote, see, even someone with writing a whole book opposing left anti-Semitism says it's not a form of racism and not a form of oppression, ... Even if it does exist, it can't be that serious then, can it? End quote. That would be a profoundly bad faith reading of my argument, which I hope I may go some way to warding off by anticipating it. Designating left anti-Semitism as an ideological bigotry, rather than as an oppression that implies primarily political, rather than racialized hostility to Jews, is an analytical, not moral argument. Fundamentally, the significance of the analysis is in the approach it implies to confronting that bigotry. Racist oppression and other structural oppressions must be contested both at the level of ideas and the level of material power. Socialists fight for the labor movement to campaign for reforms to advance and consolidate equality, as part of an overall anti-capitalist program that aims to overturn the system in which oppression and inequality are rooted. At the same time, we conduct educational work within the movement against bigoted ideas linked to such oppression and inequality. But left anti-Semitism, unlike racism in general, is a bigotry that must be confronted almost exclusively at the level of ideology. That has implications for what that confrontation must consist of practically. That will be the focus of this book's next and final chapter. That's the end of chapter 7 of Daniel Randall's Confronting Anti-Semitism on the Left, Arguments for Socialists. The next chapter is chapter 8, and it's titled How to Fix the Problem. Thank you so much for listening.